The house on Maple Ridge had been my life for 6 weeks. Every weekend was swallowed by open houses, every evening by follow-up calls, every morning by careful notes on paint colors and landscaping that might win over the buyers. When the papers were finally signed $1.2 million in neat black ink, I exhaled a joy that felt rare in my line of work. I had earned this one. We gathered in the conference room the next morning. Greg leaned back in his leather chair, the corners of his mouth curled into that smug smile he wore like a badge. In front of the whole team, he slid a crisp $20 bill across the table toward me. "Here's your commission $20, he said, his voice dripping with false amusement. "Seniority has its privileges." The room stiffened. A couple of forced chuckles echoed, but most stared at their notepads. Greg slipped the rest of the commission into his pocket, tapping it once as though sealing the theft. "You should be grateful I even let you close it," he continued, his tone sharper. "Agents come and go. I can replace you any time." The words cut deeper than I expected. 20 years of loyalty late nights, endless weekends, sacrifices no one in that room knew flattened into a $20 insult. My cheeks burned, but I kept my expression still. Bethany, sitting 2 seats down, shot me a glance that said what no one dared to voice this was wrong. But silence hung heavier than truth. I picked up the bill and slipped it into my planner without a word. My hands trembled under the table, not from weakness, but from a fury I refused to show him. The laughter faded, the meeting dragged on, and Greg basked in his petty triumph. When it ended, I walked back to my desk slowly, each step deliberate. I had given him the reaction he wanted none at all. Inside, though, something shifted. 2 decades of patience had cracked, and through that fracture a colder resolve began to form. I sat down, opened my planner, and pressed the $20 bill flat against the page. It would remind me of this day, the day everything began to change. I didn't go straight home after the meeting. Instead, I marched down the hall to HR with the $20 bill still tucked inside my planner. My voice was calm, almost detached, as I explained what had happened to the sale, the commission, the way Greg pocketed nearly all of it in front of everyone. The HR manager, a soft-spoken man named Charles, nodded slowly, flipping through the policy manual as if the words might save him from taking a stance. Before he could answer, the door swung open. Greg strolled in like he owned the place, his cologne arriving a second before he did. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and smirked. "She's junior," he declared, his voice cutting through the room. "Commission belongs to me. That's how it's always been. Don't waste our time pretending otherwise." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I watched his confidence drain the moment Greg fixed him with a stare. "If that's the precedent," he muttered, his words trailing off. Greg placed a payout slip on the desk and slid it toward me with a pen. "Go ahead, Rachel. Make it official." "We don't want confusion." "Do we?" I stared at the paper, my name typed neatly above a line worth $20. Around us, a few colleagues had drifted in, drawn by the tension. Their silence was its own kind of betrayal. Though I couldn't blame them, Greg had built a career on intimidation, and fear made for loyal spectators. My hand didn't shake as I signed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, but my anger sharpened into something clearer than rage. Bethany lingered near the doorway, her eyes meeting mine. As I stood, she brushed past and whispered, "You deserve better. Don't let him crush you." I walked out without a word, the slip folded neatly in my planner beside the $20 bill. My dignity had been stripped in public, but my composure remained intact, and beneath that stillness, a seed of resolve began to grow one Greg would never see coming. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after the dishes were done, the payout slip and $20 bill laid flat before me like evidence in a trial. The silence of the house pressed in, and with it came memories I had tried for years to bury under routine. I remembered the winter when my daughter, Emily, was 5, She had a fever so high it frightened me, but I left her with my mother because a couple wanted to see a property in the middle of a snowstorm. I drove through icy roads, rehearsing details about fireplaces and insulation while praying Emily's forehead would cool by the time I got back. Then came the anniversaries dinners with my husband that never happened because I was unlocking doors for clients or smoothing down for sale signs blown sideways by the wind. I told myself every missed celebration was worth it for the stability the job promised. Greg always said the sacrifice would pay off, that loyalty would be rewarded in time. I thought of the storms I braved, the nights I stood drenched on porches with a smile plastered on my face, while Greg appeared only at closing to take the credit. He would clap me on the back, sign his name, and bask in the applause of the board, while I drove home to a sleeping child and an empty plate on the counter. For years, I swallowed the injustice because the checks cleared and the bills were paid. But this theft in plain view, this $20 insult carved out of a sale I had bled for, was different. As I closed my planner, pressing the slip and bill inside like pages in a story I hadn't finished writing, I realized I could no longer pretend patience was loyalty. It was submission, and submission had cost me too much already. The breaking point wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet shift, the moment my sacrifices stopped being excuses and became fuel. And as that fire took hold, my focus turned to the man who thought he had broken me, Greg. I stopped wasting energy on anger. Instead, I began to watch. Greg had always strutted through the office like a king, but the longer I observed, the more I noticed the cracks beneath his polished exterior. One afternoon, I overheard him bragging to a client about a record-breaking sale, yet when I cross-checked the numbers in the system, the figures didn't match. He had inflated the price and shifted commissions around like pieces on a chessboard, making sure his cut was always the largest. Another evening, while organizing files in the shared drive, I found receipts tagged as client development, steak dinners, bottles of wine, even a weekend at a resort all billed back to the company. I had been careful with every expense report, trimming coffee receipts and mileage down to the cent. While he treated the agency's account like his personal wallet, I began keeping records. Quietly, patiently, I copied emails, saved contracts, and documented conversations. Every time a client complained about hidden fees or mismanaged listings, I noted the details. Patterns emerged. And those patterns told a story even Greg wouldn't be able to laugh away. The more I looked, the bolder the inconsistencies became. In one file, his signature appeared on a property I knew I had shown, though my name had been erased. In another, he promised exclusive terms to a client that contradicted company policy. Each document was a thread, and together they wove a net. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did but chose silence. Fear had kept them in line for years, just as it had kept me. But fear was no longer my anchor. It was his. Every evening, after closing my laptop at the office, I opened another at home. There, away from Greg's watchful eyes, I built a quiet archive. I labeled it simply Greg File. The more I added, the calmer I became. I didn't need to match his smirks with anger. I only needed to wait. His greed was loud enough to expose him. I was just giving it a microphone, and with each document, I felt the fire inside me sharpen into purpose. The folder on my home computer grew heavier with each passing week. Misused funds, doctored contracts, angry emails from clients who felt cheated. Each file slipped into place with a quiet precision that steadied me. I gave it a name that made me almost smile. Greg File. Neat, simple, undeniable. At the office, nothing seemed to change on the surface. Greg strutted through the hallways, tossing orders like crumbs. In team meetings, he found new ways to sharpen his blade against me. "She's past her prime," he said once, laughing as if it were harmless, replaceable. "We need energy, not nostalgia." The words stung, but only for a moment. I had trained half the people in that room. I knew their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears. And I also knew that the man belittling me was already standing on a collapsing foundation. Across the table, David caught my eye. He didn't speak. Greg's shadow was too heavy for open defiance, but his steady look was enough. Years ago, I had taught him how to close his first deal, how to keep his composure when clients tested his patience. Now, in his silence, he was giving me back what I had once given him: quiet support. I held on to that dignity like armor. I refused to let Greg see the satisfaction his barbs were meant to provoke. When he smirked, I stayed still. When he mocked, I took notes. And when he dismissed me as replaceable, I thought of the folder waiting at home, growing larger with every careless step he took. Patience had become my sharpest weapon. I no longer needed to fight him with words or anger. I only needed to let him keep talking, keep boasting, keep cutting himself deeper with the arrogance he mistook for power. Each day I walked out of the office carrying nothing but my planner, but inside me was a certainty stronger than rage. The weight of truth was no longer on my shoulders. It was gathering above his head, waiting for the moment to fall. While Greg filled his days with photo shoots and puff pieces in glossy real estate magazines, I focused on something quieter, something he'd long forgotten: trust. I returned calls at odd hours, walked nervous buyers through contracts line by line, and showed up with solutions when problems threatened to derail deals. Clients didn't just feel like transactions with me. They felt heard. It didn't take long for that difference to speak louder than any advertisement. 3 of my biggest clients, the ones Greg bragged about in every board meeting, made their stance clear. We signed because of her. One said, her voice firm, "Not the agency. If she's not managing our listings, we walk." Their words settled into me like a secret strength. I didn't advertise it, didn't boast. But slowly, like a tide turning, more clients began reaching out directly. Contracts that once had Greg's name at the top were rewritten with mine. Complaints filtered through the office. "We don't trust him. We want Rachel." Greg, of course, didn't see it. He was too busy arranging interviews about his visionary leadership, his smile plastered across articles that praised the company's growth. He never realized that the very foundation of that growth was shifting beneath him. David noticed, though. He caught me in the break room one evening, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Half the office wishes they could work with you," he said, glancing at the door. "Not him. Everyone knows who the real backbone is." I met his gaze, steady but silent. Gratitude stirred in me, though I didn't say it aloud. The walls had ears, and Greg's shadow was never far. But I carried David's words with me as I walked back to my desk, the corners of my mouth betraying the smallest curve of a smile. The shift wasn't loud or sudden. It was a quiet migration, client by client, trust by trust. And as Greg paraded his hollow victories in public, I knew the real victories were already in my hands, waiting for the moment he'd finally notice. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning, in front of the entire team. Greg leaned across the table, voice raised just enough for every ear to catch. "Rachel here still thinks she's essential." He jeered. "Truth is, she's just sentimental weight, replaceable." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the room. I didn't flinch. I had already made my decision. That evening, I stayed late, printing one final document, not for a client, not for a sale, but for myself. I slipped 2 papers into a plain envelope, my letter of resignation, and the Greg file. The next day, I walked into HR with steady steps. Charles looked startled when I handed him the envelope, but before he could open it, Greg appeared in the doorway, smug as ever. Well, he drawled, finally throwing in the towel. His eyes danced with mock triumph. "I'm resigning," I said simply. "Good," he snapped, snatching the envelope from Charles's desk without even glancing inside. He held it between 2 fingers like it was a soiled tissue. "Don't let the door hit you on your way out." I gave him nothing, no anger, no reaction, Just silence. That silence unsettled him more than any outburst could. When I returned to my desk, Bethany was waiting. She stood quickly, pulling me into a brief hug before letting go, her eyes glassy. "You deserve better," she whispered. I smiled faintly, gathering the last of my things. Around me, colleagues pretended to stay focused on their screens, but their eyes flickered toward me with something between guilt and respect. I walked out without looking back, the weight of my resignation both heavy and liberating. Greg's laughter followed me down the hall, loud and hollow. He had no idea that inside the envelope he dismissed so casually was more than my resignation. It was a fuse waiting to be lit, and as the glass doors closed behind me, the city air rushing in, I felt lighter than I had in years, ready for what I knew was coming next. I didn't have to wait long. By Monday morning, the office I had left behind was in flames, not literal ones, but the kind arrogance always sparks when it's finally cornered. The first calls came from 3 major clients. They weren't just canceling contracts, they were demanding explanations. Millions of dollars vanished in a single sweep, deals Greg had bragged about only weeks earlier. "We signed because of Rachel," they said bluntly. "She's gone. So are we." By mid-morning, regulators arrived with questions about compliance. Numbers weren't adding up. Expenses were inconsistent, and files that should have been airtight had gaping holes. The Greg file had finally begun to speak, and its echoes reached the ears that mattered. I heard about it through Bethany, who called me on her lunch break, her voice both hushed and electric. "It's chaos here. The board called an emergency meeting. They're tearing through everything. People keep whispering your name." I could picture it clearly. Greg pacing the boardroom, his shirt collar damp, blaming junior agents, blaming HR, blaming even the clients themselves. But excuses had a way of shrinking under scrutiny. For years, he had buried his sins beneath my labor, and now, without me there to hold the weight, the rot was showing. Rumors swirled through the office corridors like wildfire. Rachel left, and she took the clients with her. It wasn't entirely true. I hadn't asked anyone to follow me, but trust has its own gravity, and Greg had none left. The board members, once dazzled by his bravado, were no longer convinced. Numbers don't bend under charm. Reports don't rewrite themselves under a smirk. And loyalty, once fractured, doesn't repair with empty words. As Bethany described the scene, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee cooling in my hands, calm in the eye of the storm. Greg was discovering the cost of underestimating silence. The foundation he had mocked me upon was crumbling beneath him, and the collapse was only beginning. And by the end of that week, I knew exactly where I would be standing inside the very room where his downfall was unfolding. The emergency meeting was already in full swing when I stepped into the boardroom. Greg stood at the head of the table, his voice raised, his hands slicing the air with practiced indignation. "She sabotaged us," he insisted. "Rachel Hayes poisoned our clients against us. She walked out and took them with her." The board members shifted in their seats, their expressions tight with doubt. One of them, Mr. Ellison, a man who had watched me work for years, looked toward the door as I entered. "Actually," he said evenly, "we've invited her here. We want to hear both sides." Greg's jaw tightened as his eyes found mine. His smirk flickered, but he recovered quickly. "You don't belong here," he sneered. "You quit." I set my folder on the table, the same one that had lived quietly on my desk for months. "I don't need to belong here, Greg." The truth does, one by one. I laid out the contents of the Greg file contracts altered beyond recognition. Emails from furious clients, expense reports that read like shopping lists for his private life. Each page landed with a weight that silence couldn't mask. Greg scrambled, pulling out spreadsheets filled with doctored numbers, trying to bury my evidence under his performance. But for every page he produced, I countered with the original time-stamped, authenticated, undeniable. His voice grew louder, his tone desperate. Mine stayed calm. The room grew still. Papers lay scattered across the table like fragments of a mask torn away. The board's gaze shifted from him to me, then back to him, their silence sharper than any accusation. Greg's smirk was gone now, replaced by a sheen of sweat and the twitch of a man cornered. He tried to speak again, but the weight of his own lies held him down. For the first time in 20 years, I watched him shrink, not with glee, but with certainty. The board wasn't looking for a villain to blame anymore. They had found one. And as their decision formed in the quiet, I knew the next move would finally end his reign. The decision came swiftly. Greg was stripped of his title before the meeting even ended, escorted out with none of the bravado he once flaunted. His protests turned to stammers. His swagger dissolved into silence as investigators were called. Fraud wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a charge waiting to be filed. The board turned to me. For the first time, their eyes carried something other than dismissal. They carried respect. "Rachel." "Mr. Ellison said carefully, "We'd like you to step in as director of sales." I let the words hang in the air. A part of me wanted to nod immediately, to claim what I had earned after decades of endurance. But the fire inside me wasn't fueled by titles, it was fueled by justice. I leaned forward, folding my hands. "I'll take the role," I said, "on 3 conditions. First, the commission system must be rebuilt. Fairly. No more loopholes for seniority to rob those who put in the work. Second, a full audit every contract, every expense. Every deal Greg touched must be reviewed. Third, David gets promoted. He's loyal, capable, and the kind of integrity this office needs." There was a pause, then nods around the table. No one argued. The collapse they'd witnessed left them too shaken to resist. One by one, they agreed. By Friday. Greg was gone, the office cleared of his photographs and trophies. And I, Rachel Hayes, the woman once belittled with a $20 bill, walked into the office that had been his throne. I stood at the window overlooking Dallas, the city lights stretching like a promise into the horizon. The chair behind me was mine now, but the weight of it felt lighter than I expected. "They thought I was worth $20, I whispered, my reflection steady in the glass. Turns out, I was priceless. I let the silence settle, not as revenge, but as proof. The arrogant had buried themselves, and all I had done was wait. And in the end, waiting had given me everything they once thought I didn't deserve.